and welcome to the Of Interest podcast. I'm Gareth Vaughan from interest.co.nz. Last month, Housing Minister Chris Bishop gave a speech outlining the government's plans for housing. Included in Bishop's speech was a pledge to remove the ability for councils to set rules or guidelines requiring balconies and floor areas of apartments to be of a minimum size. This, the minister said, will increase housing supply by enabling more homes to be built at cheaper prices. Bishop noted, whilst shoebox apartments won't be for everyone, they're a better option than an emergency housing motel room or a car. Furthermore, young people need affordable ways into the housing market, he added, and students and young professionals often want small, low maintenance and affordable dwellings near their job and transport connections. But just because the government wants more and smaller apartments built, does that mean they'll actually be built? Who wants them? Where do they want them? Who will finance the development of them? And who will lend money to buyers? To discuss these questions and more, I'm joined by John Bolton, founder and head of mortgages at Squirrel. As a mortgage broker in Auckland, former banker and someone who has dabbled in property development, John's well placed to talk about the apartment market. Welcome, John, and good to have you back on the Of Interest podcast.
Yeah, g'day, Gareth.
So look, it'd be fair to say that the housing market's pretty quiet at the moment, even perhaps a bit moribund. So what sort of demand is there for from buyers for apartments at the moment, and what sort of buyers?
Oh, look, personally not seen a lot of demand, but it is there, and I think it is, I guess, what you describe as a target market with these policy changes, which is people that otherwise couldn't afford to buy in Auckland. And look, there's a lot of people out there like that. You know, it's pretty challenging to buy, particularly on your own. And that's often where we'll see people choose an apartment for own occupied. Because, you know, if you're on a sort of average income, sort of, you know, around 80 to 110,000, your borrowing power on that is, you know, probably less than $500,000, right? And you're just not going to get anything for that. So you're pretty much restricted down to maybe a traditional brick and tile unit out in the burbs, you know, and that's probably going to be somewhere around 50 to 60 square metres, or potentially you're looking at inner city apartments. And so, you know, they're a different kind of product, but, you know, out in the burbs, you've still got transport issues. You know, you've got other things to think about. In the inner city, you're getting maybe just a slightly different lifestyle option. I had a guy talking to me the other day, and I thought he was a classic example of someone in this space. So he was actually he was just over 50, first home buyer. He had about 150,000 in savings and an income of about 120,000. And he was just keen to get something. Now, the interesting thing for him is that we worked it out and he could pay it off before he retired. And that was his goal, you know. So he was looking to pay it off in about 15 years. And the only way he was going to be able to do that was with a shoebox apartment. But he was really happy with that. He was working on the wharfs, so downtown suited him. He'd be a classic example of, you know, I guess, target market for someone that otherwise couldn't buy.
Yeah, interesting. And how easy is it to get a loan to buy an apartment these days? I mean, you know, how big a deposit do you need, and what's the minimum sized apartments bank will lend on these days?
The minimum, so there's two types of apartments. They'll call them standard and non-standard, right? So a standard apartment, that's regular policy, and then non-standard apartment, that could be for a range of reasons, but usually related to size. That'll be different again. So a standard apartment typically starts at about 40 square metres and above. Every bank's slightly different in its policy, but I think 40 square metres is a good place to kind of draw a line. So above 40 square metres, you're largely talking standard. Below 40 square metres, you're talking non-standard, right? So above 40 square metres, 80% LVR. So nice and easy. No different to a house.
Yep.
Right? Below 40 square metres, that's where it gets tough. And quite subjective. So, you know, every bank will be sort of slightly nuanced in that space. And some banks don't really have a formal policy at all. It's on a case-by-case basis. So those smaller shoebox apartments, which are, you know, I guess that's what's described as less than 40 square meters, right? Size of a hotel room. Those are the ones where, potentially you're borrowing 50 to 60%.
Okay, so you need a much bigger deposit there.
Yeah, but they're also a lot cheaper.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, right? So with these, we'll just keep referring to them as shoebox apartments. They might be sort of certainly less than 400,000, and in a lot of instances less than 3. So at 300,000, so using my 50-odd-year-old guy the other day, with the I was talking about earlier, 150K deposit. He could easily get himself into a non-standard apartment.
Yeah. So, you talked a bit about the different attitudes from banks. I'm just curious, to what extent does apartment lending appetite differ between them? I mean, obviously, is it just around the sort of so-called shoebox, say under 40 square meters, or is it for bigger apartments as well that some are a bit reluctant?
Bigger apartments, they're typically all pretty much of a muchness. I tend to take a step back, as someone that's sort of with a bit of a credit background. It's actually around the nature of the security, right? So what banks are really looking at, when they assess credit risk, they're looking at probability of default and loss given default. Probability of default is largely around the characteristics of the borrower, right? So that doesn't really relate to property type. It does a little bit sometimes, but not much, mostly around the characteristic of the borrower. Loss given default is looking at the security type. And so when you're looking at loss given default, you're sort of saying, well, what's the risk that I could get a swing in the value of this property, right? So where that risk is high, they're going to tend to have, low LVRs, low loan to value ratios for those that don't know. And so that's largely what they're doing across all types of property, right?
Yep.
And that's reflected in their policy. So the issue with apartments is around resale risk. And so historically, because banks were reluctant lenders in there, they sort of all moved and swing together. Because no one's in there, and because that market's very hard to fund, and therefore there's not much liquidity in that part of the market, by definition, the banks are reluctant to lend, right? Because of the risks on sale, mortgagee sale, you're just not going to get a return on it. The other aspect that's sort of played out in this market is that historically, this kind of apartment market, whether it's shoebox apartments or dual key apartments, which is another interesting space, it's predominantly been investors, and a lot of this historically has been sold off to offshore investors. And so when you sort of combine that and you sort of say, look, the resale market has, the market has largely been sold off plan to offshore investors, it kind of says there's not a strong secondary market for that product. And so again, banks have been very reluctant to lend too much into that space.
Great. So that's kind of a bit of historical context around why banks have been a bit, I guess, conservative is probably a good word when it comes to smaller apartment lending.
Yeah, and look, I'm going back a long way now because I haven't been in banking for 17 years, but I do remember that in previous cycles when we've had credit issues in the residential market, they've been more pronounced in the apartment market. And in a big part because so much of it was off plan and so much was going offshore.
Okay. So in terms of the restrictions on floor size apartments now, I checked with the Auckland Council and Wellington City Council. So Auckland minimum studio dwelling size 30 square metres, except city centre has to be 35, and Wellington is 35 as well. So that is, I guess, in the shoebox category. But I mean, I don't know if you have a sense, but I mean, when Chris Bishop's talking about removing all those restrictions, do you have a sense of how much smaller people would go or want to go than that? I mean, it's quite a fascinating, I mean, obviously in some parts of the world, if you go to Hong Kong or,
I was going to say
places like that,
the
right?
cages that they live in, right? You've seen what they do there.
Yeah.
Which is
and Tokyo would be another place, big cities, especially in Asia probably, you get some really small ones. I mean, I mean, how small might people want to go in Auckland or Wellington or another part of New Zealand?
Yeah, well, I don't know, right? I mean, the interesting thing for us is that we've done a fair bit of lending in the tiny home market.
Yep.
So we're one of the only people that fund tiny homes.
Okay.
In New Zealand, and those can get pretty small. And what's really interesting is it's all about use of space, right? So if you're designing well for it, you can actually get smaller and smaller and smaller. It's actually quite amazing. I've stayed in hotels where they've had incredibly good use of space. Hotel Britomart. If anyone stays there, I just think an incredibly well designed hotel. But incredibly good use of space in those rooms, right? So I think it's workable, and there are people who with a modern lifestyle might choose that, and maybe not long term, but certainly for a period of time, right?
Yep. Okay. In terms of lenders, is there much in the way of non-bank lending in the apartment market?
No,
not at all.
No, not really. There's a little bit. Probably one of the better lenders in this space is Conrad Funds. So that's a fund manager that kind of spun off the back of Conrad, the property developers. So Conrad historically was one of the largest apartment developers in New Zealand. They've done a lot of apartments in Wellington and Auckland, big ones, and probably the masters at heading towards Shoebox. If anyone was going to build Shoebox, it would be Conrad. But those guys, big apartment builders, they set up a fund a number of years ago because they were struggling to help offshore investors buy apartments here with a level of financing. And so they're really good at apartments. So, if we were in the non-bank space needing to look at financing options, then, Conrad's probably where we would start. Okay.
So, in terms of the smaller apartments, the shoebox, for want of a better word, are the most likely buyers of them, I mean, you've actually given examples of owner-occupiers.
Yeah.
But so it could be both owner-occupiers and investors, because I guess to what extent are we maybe talking about what we're now talking about is build to rent here? That's a part of it too, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, right. So
it's a combination of investors and owner-occupiers. Probably.
Yeah. I think that build-to-rent market, there's a lot of interest in that, but the numbers have to stack up. So investors will always look at this on a yield basis. The attraction for investors historically with the shoebox apartments has been purely yield, straight yield play. They get much better yields on it than a standard apartment. So, there was a period there, particularly post-GFC, where in the second-hand market, those non-standard apartments were selling really cheap. So, I know a lot of investors that purchased, non-standard apartments on the secondary market at very attractive yields. But then as the market heated up, those yields started to drop away. But just coming back to that earlier point I made, this is exactly why the banks are, at the moment more reluctant to play in this market, is because of that price volatility. Post GFC, the value of non-standard apartments literally collapsed. And so then you had a whole lot of investors rush in and buy them because they were getting good yields. So, look, in terms of new builds, if the yield's there, investors will play. And so the challenge for developers is to get an appropriately yielding property. Otherwise, investors won't buy it, right? And as far as first-home buyers are concerned, I think we've talked to that already, but, essentially with affordability, there's a lot of people out there that have limited other options.
Yeah. It's the reality, isn't it? In terms of the actual volume that's being built, we noted the Statistics New Zealand consent figures out yesterday which were down significantly
Yeah,
for the
they
June
were.
year, and the biggest drop was in apartments actually, with numbers pretty much halving in the year to June to 1942. I'm just wondering, like, what is the property development like at the moment? How would you describe it? And especially like for apartments, is it very much still a case that that a development of an apartment block wants to pre-sell off the plan before they build?
Yeah, there's a whole lot of issues with apartments, right? So the reality is they'll want pre-sales. Pre-sales are hard to get at the moment. Pre-sales are hard to get full stop, whether it's an apartment or a townhouse. Apartments will always be harder, but pre-sales are really difficult at the moment. The other issue is construction costs, right? So construction costs for high-rise or high-density building has been very high. Steel prices were high for a long period of time. They've come back a lot, and but bearing in mind the time it takes to I guess consent these sort of projects and decide to do them and then get them consented and move through it.
You're talking about a process of what, 2 or 3 years longer?
Yeah. Well, 3 years.
Yeah.
And look, sometimes faster if it's a smaller project. The problem that a lot of the guys have got is, you've got pre-sales, getting that very difficult in the current market. You've got high construction costs, and then you just got the risk associated with that type of product, which is the fact that it takes so long to get from concept to completion, especially on bigger projects. And so when you've got a lot of uncertainty out there and you've got all these factors working against you, it's not surprising that people aren't chasing apartment building. I think I've seen articles on your website talking about just how New Zealand's kind of reinvented itself as a townhouse market, and it kind of has, right? Because as people have got priced out of standalone houses, there was a period there. Apartments were mostly sold down to property investors, whereas townhouses are much more attractive to owner occupiers. I think Kiwi first home buyers can see themselves going from the old standalone house to a townhouse that's got good utility space, access to parks and stuff. They haven't kind of jumped that next level yet to apartments. And if you think about the market at the moment, it's a market that's largely been driven by first home buyers. Townhouses have just worked incredibly well into that part of the market. Our market's mature enough that was the next step. The guys I've been working with that have been trying to get apartment projects either started or completed have really struggled. It just hasn't been happening, especially with the property investors not there, because they've been so reliant on that historically. And the investors haven't been there, I think, for a whole lot of reasons, right? But the off-plan investors haven't been there because of affordability. When you're running sort of servicing interest rates at 9%, they just don't pass.
What is the upper limit for them? I mean, if 9% is too high, how much lower do they need them to be?
Well, I think you really need, for bearing in mind there's different types of investors, right? And
Yeah.
I guess you're talking about investors that are buying stuff off plan, probably aren't overly sophisticated in terms of how they're viewing their properties. They just want to own a portfolio. They're reasonably passive. So that type of investor is pretty full at the moment. And, they probably need rates back, sort of servicing rates back down around 7, that's when you're getting an OCR down about 3.5.
Okay, so we're a little way off that at the moment.
Yeah.
And in terms of, obviously the construction, you've talked about construction costs, but obviously the capacity, the workers, etc., ebbs and flows as well, and the finance, the willingness of people to finance, the ability of people to finance this. I mean, where would you say we're at in this sort of construction building cycle at the moment?
Well, I think we're seeing per square metre rates come down quite a bit. So, it was common for us to sort of, the problem with per square metre rates is that, how long's a piece of string? It very much depends on what you're building and where you're building it, right? But it wasn't uncommon for us to sort of see per square metre rates on reasonably straightforward sort of terraced housing, townhouse type stuff, sort of getting around that 3,500 a square metre. It was, at the peak of the market, was getting up there. Some of the stuff I'm seeing now is back below 3,000, maybe getting down as low as 2,800, which to me is really starting to get quite price competitive. So there's been a lot of movement there. And look, that is because of a lot of spare capacity, and that is coming out of hourly rates and stuff. I think New Zealand system's kind of interesting. When people can take extra money, they will. And because they know that there's other parts of the cycle where they'll starve. And so we're sort of probably gone from the feast to famine. And that's definitely getting reflected back into build prices at the moment. I think, there's the bigger challenge. I never think that this thing can be solved by, there's no secret sauces. It's not one thing. It's a myriad of things that gradually work together to get this under control. So you can never look at one thing and sort of go, is that going to make a difference? Because I just don't think this market works that way at all. But if you look at the way that the current government's approaching it, they're sort of starting to talk about, releasing 30 years worth of land supply. If they do that and they properly get on top of it like they did in Canterbury, that will have a massive impact, right? And then you overlay on top of that what they're doing with building materials, moving away from the New Zealand standard towards allowing overseas standards to apply here. The competition that will bring to materials costs is significant. I already work with builders that are importing stuff from overseas significantly cheaper than they can do it here. And they're getting the benefits of that. And I think if the wider industry starts to get the benefits of that and we see an increase in competition for building materials, that's really significant as well, right? And then you go to some of these sort of rule changes around granny flats and making it easier to put, I guess, whether it's incomes or grannies into your property. I think that's significant. And you sort of start to change the rules around building sizes, which, that's significant. You add all of this together, and I think you're starting to get a suite of policies that could have a really significant long-term positive impact on keeping house prices down.
Okay. Yeah, there's certainly a lot to unpack in terms of what the government's looking at doing. It's very interesting. I guess one of the key things on apartments is location.
Yeah.
So, you talked at the start about the suburbs versus the CBD. So I guess one of the things that the government's also done is they backed off the medium density residential standards. So that is there was, of course, in 2021, the Labour and National, the bipartisan agreement to allow, the building of up to 3 houses of up to 3 stories on most city sites in New Zealand cities. But they've backed off that, and so it's optional for councils, obviously, now. I don't know, does that make a big difference? And in terms of where they're built? Because, obviously CBD is a place where we have quite a few already, in Auckland, Wellington as well. And other cities around New Zealand, as they grow, I guess demand for apartments will probably increase. Is there a danger of people being expected to live in a shoebox apartment out in the suburbs or on a greenfield development? Because would that be desirable if that was the case?
Well, this is the thing, right? Supply and demand. Let the market figure it out, right? Like no builder or developer is going to go and build shoebox apartments if there's no demand for it.
Yeah.
So...
because they're going to want to sell off the plan, so they know there's demand before they build.
Let the market decide. I think the problem is, look, we don't want to build ghettos, but let the market figure it out. You know, like I remember a developer saying to me once, you know, never build anything too high density out west because people need places to park their Tirana, you know, and and it was true, right? I mean, why would you ever build something without car parks out west? Some people have attempted it, which is a bit crazy. Look, I think there are parts of the cycle where you see just really, really bad building, like. I'm not a big fan of townhouses in the suburbs without parking. You know, I don't mind that sort of stuff close to transport nodes where people can actually go, well, I don't actually need a car and I'm quite happy to live in a townhouse, you know, because I'm next to a train or a bus or something. But, you know, there was a proliferation of townhouses getting built. There's some areas out west now where, you know, the streets are just packed with cars everywhere because, you know, these developers have gone and built blocks of apartments with no parking and the people that are buying them have cars. Where are you going to put all the bloody cars, you know? And the streets are just diabolical. Now, the challenge is that the suckers that bought those townhouses are going to lose money, because they're not going to perform well in the secondary market, because who's going to buy them? You know, because the problem's quite obvious now. And the reason that they were buying them at the time is that it was an incredibly hot housing market. We were way short on houses and everyone was kind of just riding this market up, and people that were desperate to get in would buy anything, you know, even if it didn't have a car park. They wanted a car park, but they were desperate enough that they were prepared to sacrifice the car park just to get into the market, right? Now, hopefully that's not going to repeat itself again anytime soon, but that's the part of the market where builders get away with shit. And we're not in that part of the cycle, right? So I think that, you know, the time for us to worry about it in terms of urban design and you know, how these cities get built out is when you've got a shortage of housing. And therefore developers can get away with shit that just shouldn't get built. If you really get on top of this and you get your supply demand right, then I think the market looks after itself.
It's going to be an interesting few years, as it always is in New Zealand housing, to watch how it all evolves and to see if the government's plans come to fruition. So look, thanks so much for that.
Gareth, I was just going to add something else.
Go for it.
Something that never really gets discussed much, and I think it's really, really important, is the growing population of retirees that are struggling with places to live. When we talk about shoebox apartments or just small living spaces, right? Because it could be some brick and single level brick and tile units in the suburbs. It doesn't have to be traditional high-rise apartment with shoeboxes in it. You know, just little living spaces out in the suburbs, all on one level, which gives them easy access and stuff like that. It's a really important market, and I think it's a market that is going to come with a whole lot of issues in the future because rents are so high. You know, retirees on the pension simply cannot afford to rent houses or even townhouses and, you know, multi-level townhouses. You know, it's not the right product for them. And so I think getting affordable solutions that cater to our growing retiree market, of whom, you know, an increasing proportion of them don't own property, or if they do, they need to downsize because they're taking mortgage debt into retirement. I think there's a real market there, and I think it's not the inner city shoebox that we're talking about. What we're starting to talk about is how do you cater to those communities, and then how do you build a property that's appropriate for them, that's affordable. And I can see that being out in the suburbs. I can see that being in the provinces. You know, so I think there's an opportunity here to reshape the way that parts of our market are operating.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, we know we've got growing numbers of retirees, and their wants and needs are going to differ from, you know, a 20-something who wants to be right in where the action is in the middle of the city.
Yeah.
It's a good point. Yeah. Well, look, thanks a lot, John. That is John Bolton, founder and head of mortgages at Squirrel, and I'm Gareth Thorne at interest.co.nz with another episode of our Of Interest podcast.